For more than 15 years, Fred Johns woke up before sunrise, drank the same bitter coffee, sat in endless traffic, and spent his days inside a gray office where every hour felt exactly like the one before it. His salary was good enough to pay the bills, but every paycheck seemed to cost another piece of his happiness. He watched the seasons change only through the office windows, answered hundreds of emails every week, attended meetings that solved nothing, and counted the days until the weekend. One rainy Monday morning, while staring at another spreadsheet, he suddenly realized that he could no longer imagine living the same routine for another 20 years. The thought frightened him more than unemployment itself. That evening he returned to his small apartment, sat quietly on the balcony, and made a simple list. On one side he wrote everything his job had given him. On the other side he wrote everything it had taken away. The second list was much longer. The following morning he walked into his manager's office with a calm smile and handed over his resignation letter. His colleagues thought he had found a better corporate position, but Fred simply told them that he wanted a different kind of life. Most of them laughed politely, believing he would return within a few months. A few called him brave, while others called him foolish. Fred accepted every opinion without arguing because, for the first time in many years, he no longer needed anyone else's approval. During the following weeks he sold many of his belongings. He donated old furniture, packed only the things that truly mattered, and placed everything into the back of a used pickup truck that he had recently purchased. After searching through dozens of small communities, he found an old farmhouse in a quiet valley surrounded by rolling hills, forests, and open fields. The house was far from perfect. The roof needed repairs, the wooden fence leaned in several places, weeds covered most of the garden, and the barn looked as though it had been forgotten for decades. Yet when Fred stood on the front porch and listened to the wind moving through the trees instead of traffic passing outside his window, he felt something he had not experienced for years. He felt peace. He bought the property without hesitation. On the morning he left the city, the streets were crowded as always, but Fred felt strangely light. Every kilometer carried him farther from deadlines, alarms, and endless stress. As the buildings disappeared behind him and narrow country roads stretched toward the horizon, he rolled down the truck's windows and breathed fresh air filled with the scent of grass and wildflowers. He had no detailed master plan, no guarantee of success, and no certainty about the future. All he knew was that he wanted to build a life where every day had meaning beyond earning another paycheck. As the old farmhouse finally appeared at the end of a dirt road beneath the warm afternoon sun, Fred smiled to himself and whispered that his real life was only beginning. Fred's first weeks in the farmhouse were far more difficult than he had imagined, but every challenge felt meaningful because he was solving problems for himself instead of for a company. The house greeted him each morning with another surprise. One day he discovered a leaking pipe beneath the kitchen floor. The next day he found broken shingles scattered across the roof after a strong windstorm. The old barn was filled with rusty tools, cracked wooden barrels, and decades of dust that seemed impossible to remove. Instead of feeling discouraged, Fred approached every task with patience. He watched instructional videos in the evenings whenever the internet connection allowed it. Borrowed books from the small public library in the nearby town, and slowly learned skills he had never needed during his office career. His hands became rough from carrying lumber, digging trenches, repairing fences, and painting walls, but he found unexpected satisfaction in seeing visible results at the end of every day. Unlike office work, every hour of effort changed something he could actually touch. The neighbors soon noticed the newcomer working from sunrise until sunset and began stopping by to introduce themselves. Mrs. Collins, an elderly widow who lived across the road, arrived one afternoon carrying a basket of homemade bread, fresh butter, and apple jam. She welcomed Fred warmly and explained that people in the valley looked after one another. A retired carpenter named Frank offered to help repair the porch in exchange for nothing more than conversation and a few cups of coffee. Another neighbor lent Fred an old tractor for several weekends, refusing to accept payment. Fred had spent years surrounded by thousands of people in the city while barely knowing anyone, yet within a month he had already formed genuine friendships in a town with fewer than 1,000 residents. As spring settled over the valley, the neglected land slowly began showing its potential. Fred cleared thick weeds from the backyard, removed broken branches from old fruit trees, and discovered fertile soil hidden beneath years of neglect. He marked sections for future vegetable gardens and imagined rows of tomatoes, carrots, beans, lettuce, onions, pumpkins, and potatoes growing there. Behind the barn he repaired an abandoned chicken coop whose wooden walls had nearly collapsed. Every repaired fence post and freshly painted board made the property feel less like someone else's forgotten farm and more like his own home. Evenings became Fred's favorite part of the day. Instead of staring at television screens after exhausting office hours, he carried a wooden chair onto the porch and watched the sunset paint the hills in shades of orange, gold, and deep purple. Birds filled the air with songs that replaced the constant noise of traffic. Occasionally deer appeared at the edge of the forest before disappearing quietly into the trees. The silence that had once seemed strange now became comforting. Fred realized he no longer measured time by meetings, deadlines, or weekends. Instead, he noticed the changing weather, the growth of fresh grass, and the gradual transformation of his farmhouse. Every morning brought another project, another lesson, and another small improvement. Although his savings continued to shrink while he rebuilt the property, he never regretted leaving his former career. Each nail he hammered into place and every seed he planned to plant convinced him that he was building something far more valuable than a successful career. He was building a life that truly belonged to him. By the beginning of summer, Fred finally felt ready to bring life back to the farm. The repaired chicken coop stood proudly behind the barn, the fences were secure, and fresh grass covered the fields that had once been overgrown with weeds. Early one Saturday morning, he drove to a nearby livestock market where local farmers gathered to buy and sell animals. The market was nothing like the noisy shopping centers he had known in the city. Instead of bright advertisements and crowded parking lots, there were wooden pens, tractors, pickup trucks, and people greeting one another by name. Farmers discussed weather, crops, and animal health while children chased each other between rows of hay bales. Fred spent several hours talking with experienced farmers before making any decisions. He wanted to learn as much as possible before taking responsibility for living creatures. Eventually he returned home with 6 young hens, a colorful rooster, 4 ducks, and a cheerful black and white sheepdog named Max that had been raised on a neighboring farm. Max adapted to the farmhouse immediately. Within minutes he was running across the fields, investigating every corner of the property as though he had always lived there. Every evening he waited faithfully on the porch for Fred to finish his work, wagging his tail with endless enthusiasm. Fred had never owned a dog before, but it quickly became impossible to imagine the farm without Max following him everywhere. The chickens were curious and surprisingly entertaining. They scratched the ground from morning until sunset, chasing insects and exploring every inch of the yard. The rooster proudly announced each sunrise with loud crowing that echoed through the valley. The ducks proved even more amusing. Fred built a small pond beside the garden using a waterproof liner and stones collected from the property. The ducks immediately claimed it as their kingdom, splashing happily in the water throughout the day. Watching them swim while dragonflies hovered above the surface became one of Fred's favorite daily routines. Caring for animals required discipline. Every morning began before sunrise as Fred filled water containers, prepared fresh feed, cleaned the coop, and checked that every animal was healthy. At first the schedule seemed demanding, but he soon realized that the routine gave his days a satisfying rhythm. Unlike office work, every task had a direct purpose. Healthy animals depended entirely on his care, and that responsibility gave him a deep sense of fulfillment. A few weeks later the hens laid their first eggs. Fred carefully gathered them into a small basket, smiling like a child discovering treasure. The eggs were fresher and richer than any he had ever purchased from a supermarket. Mrs. Collins laughed when Fred proudly showed her his first collection. She congratulated him and exchanged a loaf of homemade bread for a dozen eggs, insisting that neighbors should always share what they produced. Soon other neighbors began stopping by to buy fresh eggs or simply chat while Fred worked outside. The farm slowly became a gathering place where people exchanged vegetables, advice, stories, and laughter instead of money alone. One warm evening Fred sat beside the duck pond with Max resting quietly at his feet. The chickens had already returned to their coop, crickets filled the air with their songs, and the sky slowly darkened above the surrounding hills. He thought about his former life, where success had been measured by promotions, salaries, and expensive possessions. Here, success felt entirely different. It was measured by healthy animals, fertile soil, honest work, and peaceful evenings spent under open skies. As he watched the first stars appear one by one above the valley, Fred realized that the farmhouse was no longer simply a place where he lived. It had become the home he had been searching for all along. As the days grew longer and warmer, Fred turned his attention to the empty land behind the farmhouse. The soil had rested for many years, and although it was covered with weeds when he first arrived, it was rich, dark, and full of life beneath the surface. Every morning after feeding the chickens and ducks, and after taking Max for a walk around the property, Fred worked in the garden. He removed stones, pulled out stubborn roots, and mixed homemade compost into the soil. It was slow and physically demanding work, but unlike the endless reports he had once prepared in his office, every hour of effort produced visible progress. Soon neat rows began to replace the neglected field. He planted tomatoes, cucumbers, peppers, carrots, onions, lettuce, potatoes, beans, peas, pumpkins, strawberries, and several herbs including basil, parsley, mint, and rosemary. Near the old fence stood a few aging apple and pear trees that had survived years without proper care. Fred carefully pruned their branches, watered them regularly, and hoped they would reward his patience with healthy fruit. He also planted several young blueberry bushes and a few raspberry canes, imagining the harvests they might provide in the years ahead. Gardening quickly taught him one important lesson. Nature could not be rushed. Some seeds appeared within days, while others remained hidden beneath the soil for weeks. At first Fred worried whenever nothing seemed to happen, but an elderly neighbor reminded him that plants followed their own schedule, not human expectations. Those words stayed with him. Every morning he walked through the garden, noticing tiny changes that most people would never see. A small green sprout breaking through the soil. A flower opening toward the sun. A bee moving carefully from blossom to blossom. Each discovery filled him with quiet satisfaction. The garden also attracted wildlife. Butterflies drifted between colorful flowers, frogs settled near the duck pond, and countless birds visited the fruit trees throughout the day. Rather than seeing every wild creature as a problem, Fred learned that most of them helped maintain a healthy balance. Ladybugs protected the vegetables by feeding on harmful insects, while bees became essential partners in pollinating many of his plants. Even the occasional rabbit that nibbled on a few leaves reminded him that he was sharing the land instead of trying to control every part of it. Of course, not everything went according to plan. A heavy storm flattened several young bean plants, hungry caterpillars damaged some of the cabbage leaves, and a family of crows discovered that freshly planted corn was particularly delicious. Instead of becoming discouraged, Fred accepted these setbacks as part of farming. Every experienced neighbor had similar stories, and each offered practical advice rather than sympathy. Slowly Fred learned to protect his crops with simple fences, natural pest control methods, and better planting techniques. Every mistake became another lesson that no classroom could have taught him. By late summer the garden had transformed into a sea of green. Tomato vines bent beneath clusters of bright red fruit, pumpkins spread across the ground like giant green cushions, and baskets filled daily with fresh vegetables. Fred began preserving part of the harvest by making pickles, tomato sauce, jams, and dried herbs for the winter months. He gave away more produce than he could possibly eat, and his neighbors often returned the kindness with homemade cheese, fresh honey, or warm pies. Sitting on his porch one evening while looking over the flourishing garden, listening to Max snore softly beside him and hearing the gentle sounds of chickens settling into their coop, Fred realized that he had spent years chasing a future that always seemed just out of reach. Here, surrounded by growing plants, healthy animals, and generous neighbors, happiness was no longer something waiting in the distance. It had quietly taken root in the simple life he was building one day at a time. By the time autumn arrived, Fred was no longer known as the newcomer in the valley. People greeted him by name whenever he visited the small town, and his pickup truck had become a familiar sight on the quiet country roads. Every Saturday morning he loaded baskets of fresh vegetables, eggs, herbs, and homemade jams into the truck before driving to the local farmers' market. The market was held in the town square, where neighbors gathered not only to buy food but also to exchange stories, advice, and laughter. Unlike the supermarkets in the city, nobody seemed to be in a hurry. Conversations lasted longer than transactions, and everyone appeared to know one another. Fred quickly discovered that selling his produce was only one small part of the experience. The real value of the market was the friendships that grew there week after week. An elderly beekeeper named Samuel often traded jars of golden honey for fresh vegetables. A young family bought eggs from Fred every Saturday because their children insisted they tasted better than store-bought ones. Martha, who owned the town's bakery, purchased his herbs and occasionally surprised him with warm loaves of bread that had just come out of the oven. Instead of competing with one another, the local farmers supported each other. When someone had an especially large harvest of tomatoes, neighbors helped preserve them. When another farmer became ill, several families took turns feeding his animals until he recovered. Fred had spent years working in large companies that promoted teamwork while encouraging competition. Here, cooperation happened naturally without anyone talking about it. As the leaves turned shades of gold, orange, and crimson, the town prepared for its annual harvest festival. Every family contributed something. Some decorated the square with pumpkins and colorful flowers, while others cooked traditional meals or organized games for children. Fred volunteered to help build wooden stalls and benches for the celebration. Although he was still learning many local traditions, everyone welcomed his ideas and appreciated his willingness to help. On the morning of the festival, the entire valley seemed to come alive. Music filled the air, children laughed as they raced through hay bale mazes, and the smell of roasted corn, fresh pies, and grilled food drifted through the streets. Fred displayed baskets filled with apples, pumpkins, fresh eggs, herbs, and jars of homemade strawberry jam. To his surprise, nearly everything sold before lunchtime. That afternoon a local gardening competition announced its winners. Fred had entered only for fun, never expecting to receive any recognition. When his name was called for the award recognizing the healthiest vegetable garden maintained by a first-year grower, he stood frozen for a moment before the crowd applauded. Accepting the small wooden plaque, he felt a quiet sense of pride that was completely different from the promotions he had received during his corporate career. Those promotions had usually come with more responsibility, more pressure, and longer working hours. This simple award represented patience, hard work, and respect for nature. It reminded him that success did not always have to be measured in money. As winter approached, life on the farm naturally slowed. The garden produced less each week, and many trees stood bare against the cold sky. Fred spent more time repairing tools, stacking firewood, insulating the chicken coop, and preparing enough feed for the animals to last through the colder months. Evenings became longer, often ending beside the fireplace with Max sleeping peacefully on the rug while the wind whispered outside. Sometimes neighbors visited for coffee, bringing homemade desserts or simply sharing stories from years gone by. Listening to them, Fred realized that the greatest harvest he had gathered during his first year was not the vegetables, fruit, or eggs. It was the feeling of belonging. He had arrived in the valley searching for a quieter life, but along the way he had found something even more valuable, a community that treated him not as a stranger who had moved into an old farmhouse, but as one of their own. Winter settled gently over the valley, covering the hills, fields, and rooftops with a blanket of white snow. The colorful gardens of autumn disappeared beneath the frost, and the trees stood quietly against pale gray skies. Although the landscape looked asleep, Fred quickly learned that a farm never truly rested. Every morning he woke before sunrise, pulled on his thick boots and heavy coat, and stepped outside into the crisp, freezing air. Max was always waiting by the door, eager to begin another day regardless of the weather. Together they walked to the chicken coop, where the hens greeted Fred with familiar clucking as they waited for fresh food and water. The ducks preferred spending most of their time inside their sheltered pen, venturing outside only when the winter sun briefly warmed the ground. Fred checked every fence, removed snow from pathways, and made sure each animal had a warm, dry place to sleep before returning to the house for breakfast. The quiet pace of winter gave Fred time to reflect on everything that had changed during the past year. Only 12 months earlier he had spent his days sitting beneath fluorescent office lights while staring at computer screens. Now his calendar was no longer filled with meetings but with the natural rhythm of the seasons. Instead of watching weather forecasts simply to decide what clothes to wear, he paid close attention because the temperature affected his animals, his trees, and the coming harvest. Every snowfall meant extra work clearing paths and protecting water supplies from freezing. Every sunny afternoon provided an opportunity to repair tools, organize the barn, or prepare plans for the spring garden. He found comfort in these simple routines. Life was physically demanding, but his mind felt calmer than it had in many years. One snowy afternoon, while cleaning an old storage room above the barn, Fred discovered a collection of dusty notebooks hidden inside a wooden chest. They had belonged to the previous owner of the farm, a man named Thomas who had lived there for nearly 40 years before passing away. Curious, Fred carried the notebooks into the house and spent the evening reading them beside the fireplace. They were filled with handwritten observations about planting dates, weather patterns, animal care, successful harvests, and mistakes made over several decades. Thomas had recorded which apple trees produced the sweetest fruit, where wild herbs naturally grew after rainy springs, and how certain vegetables performed better in different parts of the garden. Reading those pages felt like having a conversation with someone he had never met. Fred realized that farming was not simply about growing food. It was about learning from those who had cared for the land before him and leaving knowledge for those who might one day continue the work. Inspired by the notebooks, Fred began keeping a journal of his own. Every evening he wrote about the day's weather, the health of his animals, improvements to the property, and the lessons he had learned. He also recorded small moments that numbers and calendars could never capture. The first time Max chased snowflakes across the yard. The quiet sound of ducks waddling through fresh snow. The satisfaction of repairing a broken gate with his own hands. The peaceful silence that settled over the valley after a heavy snowfall. These memories seemed just as valuable as records of harvests or expenses because they reminded him why he had chosen this life. As February slowly gave way to early signs of spring, tiny green shoots began pushing through the frozen ground near the farmhouse. Birds returned one by one, filling the mornings with cheerful songs that had been absent for months. The days grew slightly longer, and the snow melted into streams that watered the fields naturally. Standing on his porch one cool morning, Fred looked across the valley with a quiet smile. He understood now that happiness did not come from escaping hard work. It came from doing work that connected him to something real. The seasons would continue to change, bringing new challenges and new rewards, but for the first time in his adult life, Fred no longer wondered whether he was living in the right place. He already knew the answer. When spring returned for the second time since Fred had arrived in the valley, the farm no longer looked like an abandoned property waiting to be rescued. It had become a thriving homestead filled with life. The apple and pear trees burst into bloom, covering their branches with thousands of delicate white and pink flowers. Bees buzzed busily from blossom to blossom, and the vegetable garden expanded far beyond its original size. Fred had learned from every success and every mistake during his first year, and this season he planned his work with greater confidence. He rotated his crops to keep the soil healthy, built raised beds for vegetables that preferred better drainage, and installed a simple rainwater collection system beside the barn to reduce water waste during the dry summer months. Every improvement made the farm more productive while keeping it in harmony with nature. The animal family also continued to grow. The hens produced enough eggs not only for Fred but also for many families in town. The ducks welcomed several fluffy ducklings that followed their parents everywhere in a perfectly straight line, providing endless entertainment whenever visitors stopped by. Max had matured into an intelligent and dependable farm dog who seemed to understand Fred's routines without being told. He gently guided the ducks away from the vegetable beds, barked whenever unfamiliar animals wandered too close to the chickens, and faithfully accompanied Fred on every walk through the fields. One afternoon, a neighbor whose sheepdog had recently given birth offered Fred a young border collie puppy. After careful thought, he accepted. The energetic puppy, whom he named Bella, immediately began learning from Max, and before long the two dogs became inseparable companions, racing across the meadows together every morning. As production increased, Fred realized that the small farmers' market was no longer the only place where people wanted his products. Martha, the owner of the local bakery, asked if he could regularly supply fresh herbs and seasonal fruit. A nearby family-owned restaurant wanted free-range eggs and vegetables for its weekly menu. Instead of trying to expand too quickly, Fred accepted only the orders he could fulfill without sacrificing quality or exhausting himself. He had left city life precisely because he did not want endless growth to become his only goal again. He believed there was a difference between building a comfortable living and chasing unlimited profit. That decision allowed him to maintain the peaceful rhythm that had transformed his life while still earning enough to cover his expenses. One Saturday afternoon, a young couple from the city visited the farm after hearing about Fred's fresh produce. They spent nearly 2 hours asking questions about gardening, raising chickens, composting, and country life. Before leaving, the husband admitted that he often dreamed about escaping his stressful office job but feared giving up financial security. Fred smiled because he recognized the same uncertainty he had once carried. He explained that rural life was not an escape from work but a different kind of work. There were no guaranteed weekends, no paid vacations, and no one else to solve problems when they appeared. Storms damaged crops, animals became sick, and every season brought new challenges. Yet every success felt deeply personal because it came directly from his own effort. The couple left with baskets of vegetables, fresh eggs, and perhaps something even more valuable, the possibility that another way of living truly existed. That evening Fred walked slowly through the fields while Bella chased butterflies and Max watched over the farm with quiet confidence. The setting sun painted the valley with warm golden light, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of blooming fruit trees across the hills. Looking around, Fred realized that he was no longer measuring his achievements by the size of his savings account or the title printed on a business card. His wealth could be seen in healthy soil, productive gardens, loyal animals, trusted friendships, and peaceful nights free from anxiety. The farmhouse had given him much more than a new address. It had taught him that a meaningful life was not built through constant ambition but through steady care, patience, and gratitude for the simple things that often go unnoticed. By the end of the second summer, Fred's farm had become one of the most respected small homesteads in the valley. Visitors often stopped by on weekends to buy fresh produce, collect eggs, or simply admire the gardens. Children loved feeding the ducks while their parents wandered among the fruit trees, asking questions about organic gardening and sustainable living. Fred welcomed everyone with the same warmth he had once received from his neighbors. He remembered how overwhelming his first months had been and how generous people had been with their knowledge. Now it was his turn to pass those lessons on. One Saturday morning, the local elementary school organized a field trip to the farm. Nearly 30 children arrived wearing colorful hats and carrying small notebooks. Their excitement filled the air as they rushed toward the chicken coop, laughing every time a hen clucked loudly or a duck splashed into the pond. Fred guided them slowly around the property, explaining where food came from and how every part of the farm depended on the others. He showed them the compost pile that turned kitchen scraps into rich soil, the rain barrels that collected water for the garden, and the beehives that a neighbor had recently helped him install. He explained that healthy soil produced healthy plants fed both people and animals, and caring for nature meant caring for themselves. Many of the children admitted they had never seen vegetables growing in the ground before. They believed tomatoes came from supermarkets and eggs appeared inside cardboard cartons. Fred smiled gently, realizing how disconnected modern life had become from the natural world. The autumn harvest that year exceeded all expectations. Apple branches bent under the weight of ripe fruit, pumpkins covered the fields like bright orange lanterns, and baskets overflowed with peppers, carrots, onions, potatoes, and tomatoes. Fred spent long days gathering crops before the first frost arrived. Some produce was sold at the farmer's market, some was preserved for winter, and much of it was shared with neighbors. Whenever someone in the valley faced difficult times, food quietly appeared on their doorstep without anyone asking questions. This simple tradition had existed for generations, and Fred proudly became part of it. He understood that true wealth meant having enough to help others without expecting anything in return. One afternoon, while repairing a fence near the road, Fred noticed a familiar car stopping outside the farm. It was his former manager from the city, who happened to be traveling through the region on vacation. The man stepped out, looking slightly older and far more tired than Fred remembered. After greeting each other warmly, they walked through the gardens together. The manager admitted that he had always assumed Fred would eventually return to corporate life after becoming bored with farming. Instead, he found a man who looked healthier, calmer, and genuinely happy. Looking across the fields, he quietly asked whether Fred had ever regretted leaving such a stable career. Fred thought carefully before answering. He explained that he occasionally missed the convenience of city life, the variety of restaurants, and the ease of buying anything at any hour. Farming could be exhausting, unpredictable, and financially uncertain. Yet he had never once missed the constant stress, endless meetings, or feeling that his days disappeared without leaving behind anything meaningful. At the end of each evening, he could see exactly what he had accomplished with his own hands. For him, that feeling was priceless. As another harvest festival approached, the town square filled once again with music, handmade crafts, fresh food, and smiling faces. This time Fred was no longer the quiet newcomer standing uncertainly behind a small table. He helped organize the event, welcomed visitors from neighboring towns, and even gave a short talk about sustainable farming and simple living. Standing before the crowd, he looked around at the familiar faces that had become part of his everyday life. Just a few years earlier, he had believed success meant climbing higher within a company. Now he understood that success could also mean waking up each morning excited to begin the day, knowing that his work nourished both the land and the people around him. As the evening sun disappeared behind the hills and laughter echoed through the square, Fred realized that the greatest harvest of his life had never been measured in baskets of vegetables or crates of fruit. It was the quiet contentment that had steadily grown inside him, season after season, rooted deeply in the simple life he had chosen. The years passed quietly, marked not by promotions or annual performance reviews but by changing seasons, growing trees, and the familiar routines of farm life. Fred no longer counted the exact number of years since he had left the city because that chapter of his life felt increasingly distant. The farmhouse had changed along with him. The weathered barn had been fully restored, climbing roses covered the front porch during spring, and every corner of the property reflected years of careful work. Trees that had once been fragile saplings now provided generous shade during the summer. The orchard produced more fruit than Fred could harvest alone, and the vegetable garden had become a colorful patchwork of healthy crops that supplied food almost year-round. Max had grown old, his black fur slowly turning silver around his face. He no longer ran across the fields with the speed of his younger days, but he still followed Fred everywhere, never wanting to be far from his lifelong companion. Bella had become the energetic guardian of the farm, watching over the chickens and ducks with remarkable intelligence. The flock itself had expanded naturally over the years, and the cheerful sounds of clucking hens had become part of the valley's daily soundtrack. Every morning began with the same familiar rhythm. Feed the animals. Collect fresh eggs. Walk through the garden. Check the fruit trees. Water young plants if rain had been scarce. It was a routine that many people might have considered repetitive, yet Fred found endless comfort in its quiet consistency. As interest in sustainable living continued to grow, more visitors arrived at the farm hoping to learn practical skills. Some wanted advice about raising chickens in their backyards. Others dreamed of starting vegetable gardens or planting small orchards. Fred never claimed to be an expert. Instead, he shared his own experiences honestly, including the mistakes that had taught him the most valuable lessons. He explained that successful farming required patience more than perfection. Crops sometimes failed. Storms destroyed hard work overnight. Animals became ill despite careful attention. There would always be disappointments, but nature rewarded persistence far more often than impatience. His openness made people feel comfortable asking questions without fear of appearing inexperienced. Eventually, the town council invited Fred to organize monthly workshops at the community center. Together with several neighboring farmers, he taught practical subjects such as composting, seed saving, rainwater collection, fruit tree pruning, and basic animal care. The classes attracted people of all ages. Retired couples hoping to grow their own vegetables sat beside young families looking for healthier lifestyles. Teenagers who had never held a gardening tool before eagerly planted their first seeds. Fred enjoyed watching their confidence grow as much as he enjoyed watching plants emerge from the soil. He realized that knowledge became more valuable when it was shared rather than kept to oneself. One crisp autumn afternoon, Fred received an unexpected letter from a former colleague in the city. The man wrote that he had often thought about Fred's decision to leave his office job and begin a completely different life. After years of stress and burnout, he had finally resigned as well. He thanked Fred for unknowingly giving him the courage to believe that happiness could be found outside the traditional definition of success. Reading those words, Fred smiled quietly. He had never intended to inspire anyone. He had simply followed the path that felt right for him. Yet his choice had reminded someone else that meaningful change was possible. That evening Fred sat on the porch with Max resting peacefully beside his chair and Bella lying nearby, watching the fading light across the valley. The garden had nearly finished another successful season, and the trees glowed with the rich colors of autumn. A gentle breeze carried the scent of wood smoke from neighboring farms as families prepared for another cool evening. Looking across the land that had once seemed abandoned and forgotten, Fred understood that a fulfilling life was not created by one dramatic decision alone. It was built through thousands of ordinary days filled with honest work. Quiet gratitude, small acts of kindness, and the willingness to care for both the land and the people around him. Every sunrise had offered another opportunity to build that life, and every sunset reminded him how fortunate he had been to accept it. One bright spring morning, Fred stood on the porch with a warm cup of coffee in his hands and watched the sunrise spread across the valley. The golden light slowly reached the orchard, the vegetable garden, the duck pond, and the old barn that had once looked ready to collapse. Birds welcomed the new day with cheerful songs, while Bella ran happily through the grass chasing butterflies. Max, now very old, remained quietly beside Fred, content simply to watch the morning together. Looking across the land, Fred found it difficult to believe how much had changed since the day he had arrived with nothing more than a pickup truck, a few boxes, and a hope that life could be different. The farmhouse had become more than a place to live. It had become the center of a life built with patience, determination, and purpose. Every tree carried memories. Every fence had been repaired by his own hands. Every path across the property had been walked thousands of times alongside loyal dogs and curious chickens. The garden no longer represented an experiment. It had become a reliable source of food that nourished both Fred and many families in the surrounding community. The orchard produced fruit every season, the hens continued laying fresh eggs, and the ducks still filled the pond with endless energy. Nothing on the farm was perfect, yet everything belonged exactly where it was. As the years continued to pass, Fred found himself appreciating life's smallest moments more than its greatest achievements. He enjoyed the smell of fresh soil after spring rain. He smiled whenever the first tomatoes of summer ripened on the vine. He looked forward to autumn afternoons spent picking apples beneath cool blue skies and to quiet winter evenings beside the fireplace while snow covered the fields outside. The changing seasons no longer seemed like obstacles to overcome. They became gentle reminders that life was always moving forward, always offering another chance to begin again. Many people still visited the farm searching for advice, inspiration, or simply a peaceful afternoon away from busy cities. They often asked Fred the same question. What made you brave enough to leave everything behind? He always smiled before answering because he had learned that courage was not the absence of fear. He explained that he had been afraid when he resigned from his job. He had been afraid when he bought the neglected farmhouse. He had been afraid each time he faced something he did not yet know how to do. The difference was that he had stopped allowing fear to make his decisions. Once he accepted that mistakes were part of learning, every challenge became another opportunity instead of another reason to quit. One evening, after finishing his work, Fred opened the journal he had started during his first winter on the farm. Its pages now filled several thick notebooks stacked neatly on a shelf. He slowly read the earliest entries, smiling at memories of broken fences, leaking roofs, confused chickens, failed crops, and the countless lessons hidden inside those struggles. Closing the final notebook, he realized that the farm had changed him just as much as he had changed the farm. It had taught him patience when nothing grew quickly, gratitude when harvests were plentiful, resilience when storms destroyed months of hard work, and humility because nature always remains stronger than human plans. As the sun slowly disappeared behind the distant hills, Fred walked through the garden one last time before heading inside. Bella followed closely behind while the evening breeze gently moved through the fruit trees. The valley was peaceful, filled with familiar sounds that had become part of his everyday life. Looking around, Fred understood that he had never truly been searching for a different place to live. What he had been searching for was a different way to live. He had left a career that offered financial security but little personal fulfillment. In return, he had found honest work, meaningful friendships, healthy food, loyal animals, and a deep connection to the land beneath his feet. When darkness settled over the valley and the first stars appeared in the clear night sky, Fred quietly closed the farmhouse door behind him. He felt no desire to return to the city, no curiosity about the life he had left behind, and no regret for the risks he had taken. The farmhouse, the animals, the gardens, and the welcoming community had given him something that no salary, promotion, or office could ever provide. They had given him a true sense of home. And as another peaceful day came to an end, Fred knew with complete certainty that he had found exactly where he was always meant to be.